Hello and welcome back to Euro Truck Soliloquy. I am Annemie. We're playing Euro Truck Simulator. In fact, we are taking some post from Milan to Luxembourg, and we have a rather sparse set of news stories of the week to talk about. Red light, don't even care. For those of you who don't know, the basic idea of this is that I talk about stuff whilst playing Euro Truck Simulator and violating as many countries' highway codes as I can muster. That's a good start right here. So yeah, this particular episode might be on the brief side, or I might end up just talking about things that have nothing to do with this week's news for an hour or so. Or I could actually, actually talk about the stuff that's happened. I could just drag out the stories of this week for that amount of time. So what has been happening this week? Well, the big main story of the week concerns Quantic Dream and David Cage, the well-known video game-ish developer, pretentious Twazak-in-chief. He has gotten into some trouble. So, for those of you who don't know, Quantic Dream made such cinematic games as Heavy Rain and things of that sort of ilk, and Beyond Two Souls was also them, I believe. I've not actually played any of their games. Been kind of tempted every now and then, but I've always heard such deeply mixed things that I was like, let's just not even bother. But these are games whose main selling point is their story. They are billed as being quite cinematic in their storytelling, which is always a little bit odd, trying to see one art form imitate another. You don't see films trying to be more bookish. But there we go. So you'd think that a studio which is focused on stories and so on would end up with, because of the way that our world is set up, their games would in general probably be more played by women. There's no inherent reason why this should be the case, but doesn't really matter. That is how we kind of go in this world. You see far more women playing things like Life is Strange, playing things like Beyond Good and Evil, playing things like even the sort of Mass Effect and Dragon Age series, where really the gameplay does somewhat lag behind the story department of them. So you'd think it's a more female-oriented player base. You'd also think that it's a slightly more progressive player base, for fairly similar reasons. Not least is the fact that it is a newer genre of game, not your traditional sort, and therefore you tend to have more progressives playing that sort of thing. But that is, mostly by the by. But it makes the story that came out this week all the more surprising, which is that apparently there is quite a toxic culture at Quantic Dream. Now, nothing of this is proven, to my knowledge. We have a report coming from the French newspaper Le Monde, which I saw translated by Eurogamer because I don't speak French. Oh, on the wrong road. Come on, let me through. Didn't mean to smash you, but I don't really care that I did. Because Quantic Dream is, I believe, a French company. And what they say is that, so there were some reports which presented Quantic Dream's collaborators in sexual positions, sort of images, adorned with homophobic or sexist slurs or even made up to look like Nazis. And these images were supposedly sent in group emails about the company, including to David Cage. But it was only in early 2017, when the company's IT manager was the subject of a photoshopped image, that the full cache was found. And I should stop reading while I go through this toll booth. So close to not taking any damage there. Oh well. So it was only when the company's IT manager was the subject of these that the full cache was found and complaints were made. Cage and another of the bosses at Quantic Dream claimed to not have seen the worst images before then, the only ones which were funny or more or less amusing. Which sounds problematic enough. I mean, there's no issue with sending funny pictures around the office of your co-workers. That sounds, you know, somewhat endearing. But let's probably not have them be Nazis, particularly in this current day and age. Let's probably not have... So, Quantic Dream is a male-dominated company. I think the figures I saw were roughly 80-20, male to female, possibly closer to 70-30. But either way, it's largely dominated by men. I don't know about the racial breakdown, but you can feel relatively confident that it's probably not minority white, let's put it that way. And you've got to be careful at those points with trying to further put people off or make people feel like outcasts within your company when they are not anywhere near, when there is a decent minority. So you probably don't want sexist jokes, because the women are going to feel somewhat ostracized by them. They probably wouldn't be able to join in those jokes too much, or wouldn't want to at their own expense. And it would just end up becoming quite cliquey. There were further reports that David Cage himself, when he saw a video of a break-in, CCTV footage of a break-in, said to one of his Tunisian colleagues, "Is that one of your cousins?" Now, we don't know if that's true or not. I don't want to actively say that David Cage is a racist, but I mostly only bring this up because of his response to it. So David Cage's response to claims that his company has a deeply toxic atmosphere and that he himself has made some quite racist comments was the following. "You want to talk about homophobia? I work with Ellen Page, who fights for LGBT rights. You want to talk about racism? I work with Jesse Williams, who fights for civil rights in the USA. Judge me by my work." So firstly, knowing people is not your work. I mean, yes, you've made a game which features Ellen Page, but Ellen Page is not your work. But this is the same sort of argument of, I'm not racist, I have a black friend. Except possibly even slightly worse than that, because these aren't necessarily your friends, they are people whom you have paid to be, you know, around you. You can't just use their good deeds as a shield for your own particular actions. Oh, whoops. And it staggers me that this is the case. I mean, in general, it somewhat astonishes me whenever there are accusations of bullying and other sorts of negative, almost sort of schoolyard behavior. Seeing as a lot of people who are in the tech industry were, and still are, nerds. And this is not a bad thing. If you want to get good at these deeply technical pursuits, you are going to have dedicated a decent amount of your time to it. You're gonna be a nerd on the whole. So they will quite likely either have experienced or been close to people who have experienced some amount of ostracization at school. And then they themselves resort to these same tactics. The lack of empathy makes me sad. I get making problematic comments, saying things which are off-color. But then one would hope that once this was pointed out to them, they would learn from their mistakes. They would say, okay, I can see why this image of farting genitalia we have on the wall, apparently, would make some people around here uncomfortable. We don't want to make people uncomfortable. Let's take it down. It's not really helping anyone being there. It's a bit of light amusement. We can find other amusements. There's often this misconception that people who believe in progressive values are killjoys. That they don't like fun, that they're prudes, that they are somehow ashamed of any and all sexuality. And it's just not the case. Some people might be like that. But the vast majority of people that I've met who tend to actually be quite heavily involved on the progressive side of the spectrum are actually quite open and sex positive. We like sex, we like that people like sex, we're also fine if people don't like sex, and the key point here is that we try to prioritize everybody's comfort over our own individual sort of small pleasures. That's not to say that we're getting rid of all pleasure. We're not Puritans, because, as I said, we like sex. But we think that if a joke is going to bring you a small amount of pleasure for 10 minutes, but make somebody else feel deeply uncomfortable and add to a feeling of being left out, that's not a good trade-off. But no, what David Cage should have done was, I think, something more along the lines of saying, okay, if it didn't happen, if that isn't what's going on here, and I should say the Quantic Dream and David Cage do strenuously deny these allegations, he should have said, look, I've got no idea what these people are talking about. That's not happened here as far as I've seen. If people are doing these sorts of things, we will try to sort it out. Probably in less casual speech than that, but that sort of idea, right? Saying, look, I wasn't aware of this, it might have happened when I wasn't looking, it won't happen again. And that is slightly what one of their statements said. It was more along the lines of, that's not happened here. Which is fine, it's probably less fence-sitting than I would go for, but sure, that's fine. But then don't add that, oh, look, my best friend is a woman, for why you're not sexist. That's not a good argument, and it's such a trope by now. And of course, if it has happened, then don't deny it and sort your stuff out, Quantic Dream. Okay. So that is actually the major story of the week dealt with, and we are only 15 minutes in, so I guess there will be a lot of just random talking or me just stopping. So the other story I saw this week. It was a smaller story, but one that I'm quite personally excited about is that Final Fantasy XII is coming to PC. This rounds out the big games of Square Enix's Final Fantasy back catalogue. I think... So we're getting Final Fantasy XII on the 1st of February, getting Final Fantasy 15 at some point, it's at an early 2018, according to Steam. I don't know if there is a firmer date yet. I check every day, because I am a massive Final Fantasy nerd, and I would like another good Final Fantasy game. I mean, Final Fantasy 13 was alright. I feel like it could have been really good. So a lot of people rag on Final Fantasy 13 for its battle system where you would just be auto-battling the whole time. But actually I was kind of fine with that. Because what you were really controlling were your paradigms. So essentially auto-battle was the default, and you could actually specifically select skills if you wanted to vary from this. If you were at a clutch point and needed to put a debuff on or cast death or something like that, you would take it out of auto-battle. I think calling it auto-battle might have been somewhat of a mistake. But there we go. It was really leading on from where Final Fantasy XII had us with its gambit system, where, yeah, you were essentially on auto-battle because of the instructions that you programmed into it, but you could deviate from that. I think some amount of simple programming commands would have helped Final Fantasy XIII, but I think the big thing that it really needed was a lot more leveling choice. Because within... So you had your 6 classes, right? You had your Commando, your Ravager, your Sentinel, your Saboteur, your Synergist, and there was something else. I can't remember what that something else is, to be honest. So you had your 6 main classes, and essentially each character was good at 3 of them. And for the majority of the game, they could only level up those 3. I think it was only from chapter 10 out of 13 that I think you could start leveling up the other ones, and even then it was significantly slower. And what it essentially looked like, for those who don't know, was you're essentially ascending a tower, and there were nodes on that tower which you'd kind of buy with experience, which would open up further nodes on that tower to go into. And what you really want from that sort of thing... Oh, sorry, and more levels open up as you progress throughout the game. So the game essentially puts a progression-based level cap on you, which again, I'm kind of fine with it. It prevents people from level grinding too far, and essentially gives people a bit of a goal, saying that if you're finding this boss difficult, you should really only have to level up this far in order to beat them. But essentially you had a very main path, which was your little circle. Then you might have the occasional branch off it, which itself... So that might go maybe 2 or 3 deep, with maybe another branch down there if you're lucky. It really wasn't a very complicated leveling system. It's as if they looked at Final Fantasy XII's license grid system. This is the non-Zodiac job system version. But they looked at the license grid and they said, okay, this was a bit too open and freeform, let's streamline this, and then just went way too far. For me, my favourite of the leveling systems is still the Final Fantasy X Sphere Grid. I think it gives you a strong, suggested path of where to go, but also lets you go off in completely different directions and teach your white mage black magic fairly early on if you want to make her just a magical powerhouse, which is what I tend to do. Or if you really want to, turn your big heavy warrior guy into a nimble thieving roguish character. That is all available to you. It gives you freedom whilst not making it seem like every character is going to go down the same routes. I mean, on the Sphere Grid, everyone ends up learning everything anyway. But by that point, you've completed the game, right? And you're just in your post-game level grinding to try and beat your optional bosses. But yeah. I feel like if Final Fantasy XIII had had something closer to the Sphere Grid, its battle system would have been fine. I feel also if it potentially had some more jobs, I mean, it didn't have to necessarily go as crazy on jobs as something like Final Fantasy V or Final Fantasy III, where you ended up with, what, about 20 or so jobs, I think? Which kind of ended up feeling quite similar, although I really liked Final Fantasy V's system of going about it, where essentially once you'd mastered a job, or once you'd learned particular bits in a job, you could plug them into other jobs to get sort of an ideal setup. That was really quite cool, and gave a real incentive for mastering some lesser used classes. Everyone still ended up feeling the same by the end, but that's what happens by the end of the game. But yeah. What was I saying before that? Oh yeah. So, Final Fantasy 12 and 15 should round out the main series as it goes, short of putting Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on PC. I'm surprised that hasn't happened yet, to be honest. Even just porting over the Game Boy Advance, was it Dawn of Sorrows? Dawn of Souls? Dawn of Souls, I want to say. Version. That was a really quite good version. I enjoyed that. And I mean, I know that Final Fantasy 1 and 2 don't particularly get much love, and particularly compared to the later games, they're not anything special. Final Fantasy 1 in particular was... it's fine. I played it once. If it comes to PC, I might play it again. Probably not any more than that. Final Fantasy 2 gets a bit more hate, though. It was the first one to really have anything resembling a character-based story. This was back in, was it 1989, I think Final Fantasy 2 was released? So this was also quite innovative itself. This was before a lot of games outside of your text adventures were doing story. But that had an interesting leveling up system. Let me just check my fuel. How much fuel have I got left and how long is left on the journey? 270 miles. Can't actually see how much longer is left on the journey from this screen, I don't think. Am I going to need... oh, I've got loads of fuel. Cool. But so Final Fantasy II had the interesting idea of the more you use a skill, the more it levels up. It's not an uncommon thing to see nowadays. You see it a lot in the Elder Scrolls series. You pick more locks, you become better at lockpicking. And, you know, it's nothing revelatory now. So that was interesting, but what it also did was that if you didn't use a skill, you got worse at it. And when I say skill, I don't just necessarily mean things you do like your white magic, your black magic, your attacking. I mean even things like your basic stat. If you don't get hit very much, your HP will go down. If you don't attack that much, your strength will go down. And I think probably your... I think I had weapon skills as well. I can't remember if those go down. But it was a surprisingly complicated system for an early Final Fantasy. I don't think they've gone that complicated in terms of skills and attributes since. It's all been much simpler, much more sort of class-based. But so this ended up with horror stories of people arriving in the last dungeon and trying desperately to not get into fights, because if they did, at the end of it, their stats would go down and they would be in worse shape for the final boss. Which is obviously not a system that you particularly want. I must say that when I played Final Fantasy II, I didn't actually have that problem. I don't know if it's just the build that I used, or rather the builds that I used never really encountered that, or that I wasn't playing for long enough through that dungeon in order to see my stats go down. But to me, from my experience, it seemed somewhat overblown. But if other people had that, then yeah, that would suck. And it seems like a weird situation to get into where you actually want to get hit in battles to make sure that you're in tip-top shape to fight your final boss. You know, you get hit a few times, heal up, make sure your max health doesn't go down. So yeah, that's weird. So I would like to see those come to PC, and I can't imagine it would be that much effort, seeing as they've ported it. They ported it not hugely long ago, as, you know, Game Boy Advance, when they last did, I think when they last did a huge batch of ports, because that's when you got things like, I think you got Final Fantasy 1 and 2, I think you got 4, 5, and I think you got 6 on the Game Boy Advance. Then it wasn't until the DS that you got Final Fantasy 3 and 4 again, and they made it worse somehow by actively taking out the post-game dungeon. And unfortunately, that's the port that we've got on PC. I'd really like to see the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy 4 on PC, because I really like Final Fantasy 4. But yeah, Final Fantasy 12, that's me talking for about as long about Final Fantasy as the Quantic Dream news, which I'm sure shouldn't happen. So that is all the news for this week. I've been playing a few games. So, this week. So last week I think I talked a decent amount about my playthrough of Dark Souls 3. I'm actually just getting up to the end right now, so I might do a video on it soon with my thoughts, probably when I start New Game Plus. And I'll just play through that a little bit and talk whilst doing it, and hopefully not get my backside handed to me by these suddenly much more difficult enemies. But no, I'm really enjoying it. I think I talked last week about how I started as a sorcerer, and that didn't go that well. Come on, police car, let me by. There we go. But no, I'm playing as a much more melee-oriented character right now. I started the game mostly on, well, once I'd gotten hold of it on the Hollow Slayer Greatsword, but I've fallen in love with the Sellsword Twin Blades. They're a really quick weapon. I've made them sharp as well. A really quick weapon which has just been slicing through the bosses. So there's one of the bosses, Pontiff Sulivan. I had quite a lot of trouble with that boss when I was using the Hollow Slayer Greatsword. But I think I did about 10 to 15 tries with a Hollow Slayer Greatsword and just couldn't get him. I think I got him to the second stage once. Switched to the Sellsword Twin Blades, and I think I died really quickly on the first time because I got kind of stun locked. But second time, I was actually kind of surprised. I was like, I've already killed the guy? What? Which was a weird feeling. And really kind of shows that the Hollow Slayer Greatsword probably wasn't right for the combination of my playstyle and that boss. Whereas the Twin Blades, oh, just amazing. But the other things I've been playing this week, I've been playing some of Okami HD. I can't remember if I talked about this at all last week. But I was... So I've got some thoughts about Okami. The first thought is that, oh, the intro is so long. I started playing it when I was actually a little bit tired, and I was like, I'm too tired for this intro. It's just making me read a load of text whilst yammering at me really irritatingly, making me take my headphones off so I didn't have to listen to it. I would have stopped the intro and be like, no, I'm doing this at another point, but I didn't want to have to sit through that bit again. And it was a classic case of the whole, why aren't you letting me playing this syndrome. Definitely a real syndrome. But it's getting a bit better now. It still feels dated. It's really pretty, but there's, as in art direction style, and it runs fairly smoothly. But on an HD remaster on PC, and there is substantial and noticeable pop-in, that's not really acceptable. And the other thing I've been playing is Life is Strange, which I'm also hopefully going to be doing a video of it, because I've been really enjoying it. I really like the character designs in that, because they just look like people. As you might have noticed from my Hellblade review, I like it when there are women in games who don't look... who aren't sexualized in any way. And I think that both Chloe and Max are really attractive characters. But they're not just all about their physical assets. And that's really nice to see. So I think I'm probably going to stop as soon as I've delivered this, because I've really not got much more to talk about. I could keep talking about Final Fantasy for ages and turn this into the Final Fantasy podcast, or lament about how we've not seen Dragon Age 8 with a PC release, which I would like. Get on that, Square Enix. But I think this is just going to be a nice little short Euro Truck Soliloquy today. So, if you've enjoyed this, I would be truly honoured if you would like and subscribe. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. That would be appreciated. And more than that, I hope that you just have a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye.